And crossband is nothing more than a repeater, folks, and we're all quite familiar with the repeaters. The regular repeater talk VHF to VHF back and forth, and all crossband does is use two bands. It uses one band as VHF and the other band as UHF, and we go back and forth, but it's simply also repeater, just using a little bit of different frequencies to work with. Why do we do this? We want to talk and listen to what's going on. So to help us out, we put a repeater on top of the mic, a mountain, grab a handheld and shoot a signal up there in VHF. And that repeater turns the signal VHF for us to listen on and everybody else to listen on. And that'd be just a regular good old standard repeater. However, we can do a crossband repeater up on top of that mountain, send a UHF signal up the mountain. That's transmitted back down as a VHF signal. Same difference, we're just using two different bands there. But there's a lot of little intricacies involved when we get into the crossband. 6 major considerations we want to think about on why do we use a crossband? Why bother with it anyway? The 6 considerations are power, what we'll call clearance, penetration, relays, and a duplexer, and cost. We'll go through these one at a time for folks. Increased power, we all know that. You could take a 5-watt handheld, beam it up there to a car that's got a crossband going, and the car will send out 50 watts. So we can, with a crossband, increase power. We can jump over objects. We can put crossband repeater on top of the mountain and send the signal up from one side to the other. So that's clearance. And when we're down in valleys on many of our event callouts, having that clearance is really a critical item. Well, another one that some folks don't think about a lot, but out of building penetration. Oftentimes, especially at the hospital, we might get called in and we need to get a signal out to the big repeaters, but our little handheld is not going to get through all the bricks and concrete and wires and rebar in the walls. So somebody sets a car up just outside the hospital. All we got to do is get out with enough strength to reach that car and let the car crossband it up the mountain to the main repeater. So penetration out of buildings is consideration 3. Number 4 is we can relay messages over great distance without having a repeater. For example, original message can come into, oh, this car up here. It sends it to a next car mobile, next car mobile, next car mobile. And it gets a little more complex. We have to leapfrog back and forth, UHF to VHF, VHF to UHF, UHF to VHF. To give you a little bit of an idea, this is one exercise that the Park County Amateur Radio Emergency Services did, was to set up a relay between Gardner and Livingston, or Livingston to Gardner, whichever way you wanted to go. Our goal was to just have a single line of radios up and down the valley, letting us make that message to Gardner without somebody having to be at each spot and relaying a message. In other words, hearing it and re-saying it. We didn't want to play the game of gossip. We wanted to be able to push the talk button in Gardner Operating Center, and they would hear us in the Livingston Emergency Operating Center, or vice versa. They could push the button and we would hear them down here with no relays. One of the problems, though, is there is a delay because you've got so many units in there, and you got to wait about 2 seconds each time it's pushed. Here's a little example of how we did it. This is a batch of the hams that were involved in this assignment. Each circle is a ham at a position with a set of frequencies, and we go back and forth. Now, it gets a little more complex. You got to choose your frequencies carefully, and to send a message south, you work one set of frequencies. Send a message north, you work another set of frequencies. And that's a little more complex, though, than I want to get into tonight. I want to just cover some of the basics. But this is to give you an idea of the working relay system we set up one day so we could stand in an operating center in Gardner and talk into the EOC in the county building in Livingston, Montana. But there's this other consideration called the duplexer complex. And that's an interesting thing. See, there's this rule of radios. You can't transmit and receive on the same frequency at the same time on the same antenna. It's just not going to work, folks. So what we have to do is we offset. If we call in, say, on 146.98 to the repeater, we have a negative offset down to 146.38. But you still have got two VHF signals on the same antenna, and you need to isolate them so they don't interfere with each other. And you do that with cavity filters. And here you can see 3 of a set of 6 cavity filters up at one of our repeater sites. The problem with cavity filters is they are quite sensitive. You have to tune them very carefully, and you can easily invest $2,000 to $3,000 just in the cavity filters. And us hams don't have that money, let alone room to carry 6 of these around with us on a car on an event. So the solution is we will go to Crossband. Now, for an event, be this an emergency call out or a bicycle ride or something like that, we're going to use them for a couple of different purposes: power and clearance, and personal. Now, we've already talked about power. Small radio at the bottom, up to the crossband, sends out 5 watts to 50 watts. We've already talked about getting it over the mountains. So we're out on, say, the Montana Road Tour, which is going up over Beartooth Pass from Red Lodge to Cook City, and that out over Indian Pass to the other side down towards Cody. Well, we need a lot of clearance to get over those passes. But the other use is personal use. Now, personal use works something like this. This repeater up here could be a VHF, UHF, doesn't matter up here. It could be a crossband. But if we're out on an event, you need to get out of your car and go look around away from your car, which you'd normally be talking on the event. You set your mobile up to crossband. Then you carry your handheld with you. You radio over to the car or listen from the car, whichever, and that signal will go up to whatever repeater this is up on top. There is quite a danger in this, though. You must not use the event frequencies on your car. And that is a real problem because it will create a level of feedback if you use one of the 2 frequencies that are already in the crossband. And that level of feedback can set to blow everybody's ears all the way along that's listening, and basically shut down the system, because the whine and the wail over the repeater, you've got to shut it off until you can get the offending radio system out of the way. And we have seen this happen on a couple of our events in the past. Let's think for a moment then on how do we program radios to work in crossband. Different radios have different methods, but there are some general principles that I'll talk about. Basically 5 principles. You may have to turn your radio on in the software. For instance, the TYT 8000 must be turned on within the software before you can make the radio work without the software. Once you've got it turned on, then you go to your VFO, that's variable frequency oscillator, and the variable frequency oscillator will allow you to program mechanically or even with a computer into your radio. We'll say we're working a mobile radio. You're going to program in a VHF frequency, a UHF frequency. Then you have to enter the crossband mode, and that's different on different radios. When you're up and going, microphones will often, depend on the radio system, pick up feedback, put it into the relay, and cause havoc. So you either have to turn off your microphone, unplug it, or simply turn down the volume to 0 on the microphone. So let me go through an example here. I'm going to work with the Yaesu 400, and on the Yaesu 400, it has 2 visible bands, band A up here on top, band B down below. Go into the VFO mode. You see it identified right there and right here. And what we're going to do is put a VHF frequency typically on top and a UHF frequency typically on the bottom. Once you've entered the frequencies, turn the radio off. Now, it could be slightly different in other brands of radios, but for the Yaesu, you've entered the frequency in VFO, turn it off. Then the next thing you've got to do is bring up the radio into crossband. 400s are kind of a pain in the butt. It's almost magic. You've got to take 3 fingers, 1, 2, 3, and push all three of these buttons at exactly the same time when you turn on with the fourth button. So this is a two-handed operation. Once you turn it on, though, if you look at this radio is just still working like a dual band radio. But when it turns on, there'll be an indicator. Notice now that it's in crossband repeater mode, the indicator right here. If you're working with any model radio and you try to bring it up in crossband, there will be an indicator, and you need to spot that indicator and make sure it says crossband. Otherwise, it's just simply not going to work for you. And that caveat in red: if your microphone picks up any of the ambient noise, unplug it, turn it down to no volume, do something to get it out of the system. When you're done, you also, though, have to get out of crossband. With the Yaesus, you turn off the radio, then you hold in those three buttons again, and you turn it on, and you see if that indicator is here. If the indicator is there, you're still in crossband. Turn it off and do it again until you get out of there. Okay, that is what we're going to ask people to do on the Big Montana Road Tour, is have a mobile in their car that can be set on crossband. But now let's look at what you might do if you wanted to be out of your car and you wanted to talk to your car. So you need a handheld radio, simplex radio that's got two bands, typically on top for VHF, bottom for UHF. Depending on the radio, it may have a function often abbreviated as TDR, or transmit and dual receive. This must be turned off in order to program the radio and make it work right. So if you've got a radio that allows you to be listening to both bands at the same time, that's called dual receive. You need to turn that off. And then you go ahead with the programming, just as I was explaining before. We got some real radio aficionados on here, so I'm going to take you to a more elegant way to program that simplex dual band handheld radio. What you need to do, and I've just thrown some frequencies in here, nothing magic about these numbers. Take your receive frequency, put up your transmit frequency below it, and subtract. So the difference between the two is 292.99 megahertz. Enter the VFO mode. We'll turn off transmit and dual receive. And while we're in that mode, we are going to enter the frequency 440.150 UHF frequency. And then you go into your menu. And my example I'm doing is a Baofeng, because a lot of people have them. But whatever your menu on your radio, you go to the offset. And in the offset, you're going to offset it by minus 292.99, the difference. So first I key in the number, and then I set the offset direction, and I'll use a negative sign, the minus sign. And if you have a Baofeng, you can check this by pressing your star key, but don't worry about that. So receive frequency, subtract the transmit, and that offset you're going to apply to the receive frequency. Then the last step is you save this. So pick out an empty channel and go in and save 440.150 with an offset of 292.99. Once that's saved in there, all you have to do is push your push to talk button. So you've taken up only one channel on your radio, and when you push, it will allow you to transmit. You take your finger off and you will be receiving.